The world, to me, had always been a tapestry of precise lines and unwavering certainties. My name is Reid, and for 20 years, the elegant science of cartography has been the very breath in my lungs, the steady beat of my heart. I charted rivers that snake like silver threads, etched mountains that rose with stoic grandeur, and penned the delicate lattice of human habitation with a meticulous hand. My maps were not just guides, they were portraits of truth, each contour and coordinate a testament to verifiable reality. Then came the letter, crisp and unsettling, bearing the seal of a distant solicitor. An ancestral estate, it declared, passed down through generations, now mine. It was a place I'd only ever heard whispered in hushed tones, a sprawling, forgotten relic tucked away in a remote valley, far from any charted course I knew. Curiosity, a rare beast in my ordered world, stirred within me. I packed my instruments, my compasses, my precise rulers, and set off, a silent pilgrimage into the unknown margins of my own lineage. The estate, when I finally reached it, was a tomb of forgotten grandeur. Stone walls wept moss, gables sagged like weary shoulders, and the air itself tasted of decay and damp earth. Inside, shadows clung to every corner, thick as velvet. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating the ghosts of generations. Among the family heirlooms, tucked away in a forgotten chest beneath a shroud of brittle linen, I found it, a map. It was not of the world I knew, nor of any style I recognized. Fashioned from thick, tanned vellum, it depicted the estate and its surrounding lands with an unnerving, almost obsessive detail. Every ancient oak, every winding stream, every rise and fall of the terrain was rendered with exquisite, almost living precision. Yet, it was unsettlingly incomplete. Vast swaths of the parchment remained blank, bordered by strange, archaic symbols that writhed like trapped serpents. There were features marked deep wells, standing stones, a structure half buried on a distant ridge that appeared on no modern survey, no deed, no historical record I could find. "What ghost did you chart?" I murmured, my fingers tracing the delicate, unsettling lines. The vellum felt cool, almost alive, beneath my touch. A shiver, not entirely from the estate's pervasive chill, traced its way up my spine. This was no ordinary map, it was an enigma, a challenge to my very profession. And a cartographer, above all else, cherishes the unraveling of mysteries. This estate, with its silent secrets and this impossible map, had begun to map itself onto the landscape of my soul. My first weeks were a dance between my professional rigor and the estate's silent resistance. I sought to impose order, to reconcile the map's cryptic etchings with the physical world. Armed with my modern instruments, GPS, laser rangefinders, a drone that hummed like an angry bee, I began my survey. The discrepancies were immediate, jarring. "Impossible," I muttered, staring at my tablet, then back at a cluster of gnarled, ancient oaks. The vellum map showed a clear, circular clearing here, complete with what appeared to be a crumbling stone altar. My drone's aerial photos, however, revealed nothing but an impenetrable thicket. It's as if the land itself has shifted, or memory has been deliberately erased. I pushed deeper, hacking through brambles that clawed at my clothes, into parts of the estate that felt untouched by human foot in centuries. Here, the map became my only reliable guide, pointing to overgrown structures not found on any modern deed. I discovered the skeletal remains of a small chapel, its roof long collapsed, its stones swallowed by ivy, exactly where the old map indicated a place of quiet reflection. Its silence was profound, almost reverent, broken only by the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. The shadows here were unnaturally deep, clinging to the ground even under the midday sun, like pools of ink that refused to evaporate. And the stone markers. They were the most perplexing. Roughly hewn monoliths, some half-buried, others leaning precariously, dotted the landscape in a pattern that defied logic or common agricultural practice. They formed no fence, no boundary, no obvious path. They simply were, silent sentinels marking nothing I understood. As I worked, the estate began to reveal itself in subtler, more unsettling ways. There were cold spots that drifted like unseen currents, chilling me to the bone even on a warm afternoon. I'd feel a sudden drop in temperature, a prickling sensation on my skin, as if an invisible door had opened to a winter night. Peculiar sounds. The dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through the grime-streaked library windows, a silent, perpetual snow. I had buried myself within these walls for days, the world outside shrinking to the dimensions of parchment and brittle leather. My fingers, stained with the residue of forgotten generations, traced lines in ancient texts, my breath catching in the stale air. The estate, in its vast, decaying silence, felt less like a refuge and more like a mausoleum I was slowly excavating from the inside out. The map, my constant companion, lay splayed across a nearby table, its incomplete contours mocking me. Each cryptic symbol, each vaguely delineated feature, now seemed to thrum with a nascent energy, drawing my gaze back to it every few minutes. I was no longer merely verifying its accuracy, I was trying to understand its language. My initial search had been haphazard, a desperate rummaging through any box or chest that seemed to hold paper. But a pattern, faint at first, then growing sharper, began to emerge. The earliest records, written in a spidery, almost illegible hand, spoke of the blight, a recurring malady that afflicted the estate's inhabitants. Not a physical illness, it seemed, but a corrosion of the mind. The gardener, he speaks to the stones, one journal entry from the early 18th century proclaimed, the ink faded to sepia. His eyes hold the glint of the moon, though the sun shines full. Another, a century later, by a different hand, my dear sister, she wanders the woods, singing to that hollow place. My eyes darted to the map. A section, near the western boundary, remained stubbornly blank, but I remembered the peculiar depression in the earth I'd glimpsed during my initial forays. I worked methodically, creating a timeline, cross-referencing names and dates. These were correspondences between successive estate owners and various distant relatives, filled with euphemisms and veiled anxieties. We regret to inform you of the sudden departure of our eldest son. He has gone to seek solace elsewhere, far from the influence of this troubled land. Departure was a gentle word for what I suspected. The mentions of solace elsewhere often coincided with a particular family name vanishing from the estate's rolls entirely. Not a death, not a relocation, but an erasure. I leaned closer to a particularly unsettling letter from 1888, the script hurried, almost frantic. It calls from beneath, cousin, and the old map. It shows the way to its hungry maw. The map. Always the map. I rose, my knees stiff, and paced the perimeter of the room, my gaze snagging on the ancient portraits that watched from their gilded frames. Were their eyes truly vacant, or did they hold the echoes of what they had witnessed? The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. A sudden, sharp creak sounded from the far side of the library, near the rarely used servants' entrance. I froze, every nerve strung taut. The house was supposed to be empty. My breath hitched. I waited, listening, but the sound was not repeated. Only the sigh of the wind outside, a mournful lament against the panes. I returned to my findings, my heart beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The disappearances, I discovered, were clustered around specific dates, often coinciding with significant celestial events or changes in the seasons, particularly the autumnal equinox. The weight of it all pressed down on me. I began to see the property not as a collection of fields and forests, but as a living, breathing entity, its pulse recorded in these forgotten texts. And the map. Driven by an insatiable, almost frantic curiosity, I decided to venture deeper into the house's less trodden paths, seeking more records, more clues. I found myself in a section of the house I hadn't properly explored, a narrow corridor that terminated in a peculiar architectural anomaly, a stairwell that loops back to the same landing. It was an irrational piece of design, serving no apparent purpose other than to disorient. It felt as if time itself was snagged here, caught in an endless rotation. The estate was not merely old, it was actively remembering. And what it remembered, it seemed to demand. The map was not just a guide to hidden features, it was a key. A key to something ancient, something malevolent, buried beneath this land. And I, Reid, had somehow become its unwilling keeper, fated to unlock its terrible secret. The silence that had followed me from the peculiar stairwell was not a bomb, but a shroud woven from anticipation. It pressed against my eardrums, a palpable weight in the air, thick with the unsaid. The map, unfurled on my desk, seemed to pulse faintly under the lamplight, its incomplete lines now less a puzzle and more a prophecy. I tried to focus, to lose myself in the precise strokes of my own ink, but the estate had begun to speak in a new, more insistent tongue. It started subtly. A faint scent of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood, would bloom in the air around me, then vanish, leaving only the memory of its foulness. They stretched and writhed in the periphery of my vision, coalescing into fleeting, indistinct shapes that dissolved before I could properly turn my gaze. It slithered into my ear, a dry, raspy utterance, like rustling leaves or parched skin. Mine yet breathed, a possessive hiss that raised gooseflesh along my arms. I dropped my pen, its clatter echoing too loudly in the sudden, absolute quiet that followed. The visions, once confined to the fitful sleep of night, now bled into my waking hours. I would be walking through the grand hall, and for a terrifying instant, the polished floorboards would dissolve beneath my feet, replaced by a churning morass of black soil, from which skeletal hands reached, grasping. The ancestral portraits, their eyes following me with unnerving precision, would sometimes twist into grimaces of agony, their painted mouths opening in silent, desperate pleas. These waking nightmares were fleeting, lasting only a fraction of a second, but each one chipped away at the edifice of my sanity, leaving me gasping, clutching at solid objects to ground myself in a reality that felt increasingly porous. The entity, or whatever malevolent force now claimed dominion, grew bolder. One evening, as I attempted to prepare a meager meal, a heavy iron skillet, hanging innocently from its hook, tore free with a screech of metal and crashed to the stone floor, sending sparks dancing in the dim kitchen. The next morning, I found every single drawer in my study pulled open, their contents scattered across the rug as if a frantic, invisible hand had searched for something specific, something vital. A faint, cloying scent of decay now clung to the air in those disturbed rooms, a sickly sweetness that made my stomach churn. My hand trembled as I reached for the old rotary telephone in the library. I needed to speak to a colleague, a friend, anyone who could offer a rational explanation, a lifeline. I dialed the number of a local historian I knew, a man with a reputation for both meticulous research and a grounded sensibility. The line crackled, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I lifted the receiver to my ear, listening intently. A faint, distorted murmur, barely audible beneath the static, seemed to emanate from the earpiece. No. I slammed the receiver back into its cradle. The outside world, it seemed, was no longer accessible to me. I was a fly caught in a spider's web, the threads of isolation tightening with each passing hour. The estate, with its ancient, brooding presence, seemed to draw me. I stood before it again, the memory of its impossible geometry, the way it twisted back upon itself, looping back to the same landing, a dizzying paradox that defied all logic. It beckoned, a silent, insidious invitation. They spoke of lineage, of bloodlines, of ancient pacts. They spoke of the map, and what it truly represented. Finish what was begun. Pay the price. The stairwell, which had once felt merely disorienting, now pulsed with a malevolent energy, a gaping maw ready to consume. The estate had remembered, and now it was demanding. And I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the profound quiet. I felt the invisible tendrils of the estate reaching for me, not with physical force, but with a psychic gravity that threatened to pull me apart. My mind, a fragile ship on a churning sea, fought against the rising tide of unreason. But the map. The map was a tether, however frayed. It was the last thread of logic in a world unraveling. With a desperate, shuddering gasp, I forced my feet to move, one leaden step after another. I didn't ascend or descend, I simply moved, a frantic insect caught in a labyrinth of its own making, until the oppressive sensation of the looping stairwell began to recede, replaced by the more familiar, if still unsettling, gloom of the main hall. The air here was heavy with the dust of ages and the faint, metallic tang that had become so pervasive. My hands trembled as I approached the heavy oak table where the map lay unfurled, a silent, accusing witness. For days, I had been poring over the newly discovered texts, a collection of brittle, leather-bound journals and loose parchments found tucked away in a hidden compartment behind a loose floorboard in the library. The script was archaic, a crabbed hand that spoke of generations of obsessive record-keeping, of secrets guarded with a zealous, almost fanatical, devotion. My earlier attempts to correlate the map's cryptic symbols with the estate's known history had been futile. It depicted no hidden treasure, no forgotten gold. Instead, there were strange, interwoven patterns, lines that converged on specific points beneath the earth, and a series of glyphs that defied any cartographic convention I knew. But the journals. They held the key. They spoke not of land ownership or architectural plans, but of containment. Beside them, in the margins, the last journal entry of an ancestor, a woman named Ilara, dated centuries ago, finally yielded its true meaning. Her elegant, yet frantic, script had seemed nonsensical before, a madwoman's ramblings. It stirs, and the land sickens. The map is not a guide to riches, but a prison's key, a diagram of the bindings that hold the sleeper in its earth-wrought cell. My breath caught. A prison. A seal. This wasn't some local ghost story. This was something vast, something primordial, entombed beneath the very ground I walked. I looked at the map again, my eyes scanning the intricate lines and symbols. The incomplete sections, which I had so meticulously tried to fill in, were not gaps in information. They were weaknesses. The lines, which I had assumed were property boundaries or geological fault lines, were in fact a complex network of arcane sigils, a protective lattice designed to hold something unspeakable at bay. And where the map was incomplete, the lattice was broken. A sudden, sharp tremor ran through the floorboards, not a structural shift, but a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated up through my bones. It was the same sensation I had felt before, a low, guttural growl from the earth itself. It calls to those of its blood, those whose hands can mend the broken wards, or tear them utterly asunder. Those of its blood. My lineage. My hands. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. I hadn't merely inherited this estate, I had been drawn here. My meticulous nature, my cartographer's obsession with detail and completion, it was all a cruel twist of fate, a predisposition that made me either the last guardian or the unwitting agent of its release. The map, which I had so eagerly sought to complete, was not merely a puzzle, it was a ritual. Each line I had drawn, each symbol I had clarified, each missing piece I had sought to restore, was either reinforcing the prison or, if done incorrectly, dismantling it brick by horrifying brick. It wasn't driving me mad, it was speaking to me, guiding my hand, compelling me to complete the map, to finish what my ancestors had started. But to what end? To seal it away forever, or to open the final door? The estate itself seemed to groan around me, a living thing in agony. The wind outside howled, a mournful dirge that carried the faint, distant sound of something scratching, clawing, from far, far below. My hands, which had once felt so capable, now trembled uncontrollably as I stared at the map. The burden of my ancestors, the great burden, had finally settled upon my shoulders, heavy and suffocating. The choice was mine, and the horror was only just beginning to truly awaken. The soil. From the deep places. One entry read, dated 1789, penned by a distant ancestor whose handwriting grew increasingly erratic towards the end. The whispers grow louder. They demand. They hunger. Another, from 1852, my brother, Elias, vanished by the standing stones. The villagers speak of the hungry earth, of things that stir beneath. The map. It shows a path, but to what? To salvation or damnation? I fear I have looked too long into its abyss. I found cryptic letters, too, exchanged between relatives, filled with veiled warnings and desperate pleas. The hungry earth. The deep places. I murmured, tracing the words with a trembling finger. It's not just a map of the land, is it? It's a map of a prison. The blank spaces on the vellum, the ones bordered by those serpentine symbols, corresponded precisely to the locations where the disappearances were most frequent, where the blight was said to be strongest. The symbols themselves, when I meticulously copied and compared them to arcane texts I found in the library, hinted at wards, at bindings, at something meant to contain. Those of its blood. My lineage. My hands. My meticulous nature, my cartographer's obsession with detail and completion, it was all a cruel twist of fate, a predisposition to a horror I was only now beginning to grasp. The weight of it pressed down, a cold, crushing force against my chest, yet beneath the dread, a steel resolve hardened within me. There was no turning back, no escape from the labyrinth that was my ancestry. The path lay ahead, etched not just on the incomplete map, but in the very marrow of my bones. The air in the library, once a sanctuary of old knowledge, now felt charged with a malevolent hum. The map lay spread before me, its ancient parchment brittle, its lines a testament to generations of secrets. My finger traced the final, incomplete section, the one that had haunted my waking hours and invaded my dreams. It depicted a winding descent, a series of forgotten passages beneath the estate, culminating in a chamber marked by an indecipherable symbol. This was it. The heart of the corruption, the locus of the entity's hunger. And I, Reid, its unwitting inheritor, was destined to complete the map, and perhaps, the cycle. I gathered the necessary implements, a sturdy lantern, its glass yellowed with age, a coil of rope, and a heavy, iron-bound box I had found hidden in a forgotten nook of the cellar, its contents still a mystery I was afraid to solve. The chill emanating from the cellar stairs was no longer merely the cold of subterranean air, it was the breath of something ancient and waiting. Each step down was a deliberate act of defiance against the instinct screaming for retreat. The cellar itself was a sprawling, stone-lined maw, larger and more intricate than I had ever suspected. Cobwebs, thick and laden with dust, draped like funeral shrouds from the low, vaulted ceilings. A section of the wall, concealed behind stacked barrels long since emptied, yielded to a hidden lever. This was the true descent. The passage beyond was a cramped, claustrophobic tunnel, sloping steeply downwards. The entity, sensing my approach, began its assault. They spoke in voices that shifted, sometimes my own, sometimes the guttural rumble of something inhuman, sometimes the thin, reedy plea of a long-dead ancestor. Turn back, Reid. It consumes all. You are not strong enough. Give in to the quiet. The path twisted, the stone underfoot becoming uneven, slick with unseen slime. My breath hitched in my throat, a dry, rasping sound. I pressed on, my grip on the lantern handle white-knuckled, my jaw aching from clenching. The air here was thick, almost viscous, and the metallic tang grew stronger, sharp and coppery. As I placed my foot on the first step, a wave of profound disorientation washed over me. The chamber seemed to tilt, the walls swaying like a drunken sailor. I saw my own reflection in the damp stone of the landing above, but it was not me. He beckoned me, his finger a skeletal claw. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing. The stairwell itself seemed to resist my ascent. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if gravity itself had intensified its pull on me. The stone groaned beneath my weight, not with the sound of settling earth, but with a living, pained sigh. The figure on the landing wavered, then solidified into an ancient, moss-covered carving I hadn't noticed before, its features eroded by time into a grotesque parody of a human face. It was the entity's trick, a desperate attempt to break my will. I reached the landing, my legs trembling, my heart hammering against my ribs. The air was a suffocating blanket, pressing in on me. The metallic smell was overwhelming now, a stench of rust and something else, something organic and decaying, yet potent. I noticed a faint, reddish sheen on the stone floor, like dried blood, though I knew it was merely mineral deposits. Or so I told myself. Beyond the looping stairwell, the passage narrowed again, descending even more sharply. The map showed this as the final approach. This was where the true reveal would be, where the entity had held its terrible court for centuries. Crude, ancient carvings, unlike anything I had ever seen in my studies of local history. My ancestors. They had been here. They had performed the ritual. The sacrifice it demanded. The figures in the carvings were not offering animals, nor inanimate objects. Their faces were etched with a terrible, desperate grief, yet also a grim resolve. my blood, my lineage, my hands. The connection was undeniable, horrifying. The tunnel opened into a vast, cavernous space, the air so thick with the metallic stench it was almost breathable. This was not merely a crypt, nor a forgotten chamber. It was a maw, a gaping wound in the earth, lined with something that was not quite stone, not quite flesh. The air vibrated with a palpable malevolence, a hunger so profound it threatened to consume me whole. I had reached the deepest, most corrupted part of the estate. And the ritual awaited. The pinprick eyes, not truly eyes, but points of malevolent light, receded into the stone. The skeletal hand, a fleeting glimpse of chalky bone, withdrew with a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. My lantern beam, a solitary defiance against the encroaching maw of the deep, trembled in my grip. Each breath scraped against a throat suddenly parched, raw. The path twisted, the stone underfoot becoming uneven, slick with unseen slime. My lantern beam danced, making the shadows writhe and stretch into monstrous shapes. I saw fleeting movement at the periphery of my vision, a pale, skeletal hand reaching from a fissure in the wall, a pair of pinprick reflections, gone as soon as they registered. This was its territory, its domain, and I was an intruder. I pressed on, the map clutched in my other hand, its parchment now damp and soft, yet its lines burned with a fierce clarity in my mind. It was more than a guide, it was a weapon, a shield. The descent steepened, the tunnel narrowing until my shoulders brushed against the cold, sweating rock. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I recognized the trick, the ancient, disorienting architecture designed to break the will, to trap the unwary in an endless cycle of despair. I had seen its impossible geometry hinted at in the forgotten margins of the estate's earliest surveys, dismissed as fanciful errors. But here it was, a spiral of rough-hewn steps, each turn leading back to the identical, moss-draped landing I had just left. My cartographer's mind, trained to find order in chaos, to impose logic upon the earth, fought against the illusion. I traced a finger over the map, finding the anomaly, the glyph that marked this very spot. It wasn't a loop, it was a focal point, a crucible. The map showed a hidden path, a precise sequence of steps within the repeating pattern, a way to break the cycle. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the map's lines burn themselves into my inner vision. Spectral figures, indistinct and shimmering, flickered at the edge of my sight, their forms suggesting long-dead ancestors, their faces twisted in silent agony. I ignored them, my gaze fixed on the specific sequence of steps the map indicated. One step here, two steps there, a pause, a turn against the natural flow. My footfalls echoed, each placement deliberate, a defiance against the entity's attempt to ensnare me in its labyrinthine illusion. The air grew thick, like breathing water. A crushing pressure settled on my chest, making each breath a struggle. My legs ached, my head throbbed, yet I pushed through the physical and mental assault, driven by a terrible resolve. Finally, with a lurch that felt like a shift in the very fabric of reality, the stairwell ceased its endless repetition. The chamber was immense, its ceiling lost in the gloom above, its walls rough, unworked stone. In the center, a raised dais of black, glassy rock shimmered faintly, reflecting the meager light of my lantern. It was not merely fear, but a profound understanding of the ancient, hungry presence that permeated this place. It was here, all around me, a voiceless, formless consciousness that had festered beneath the earth for centuries. I placed the map carefully on the dais, aligning its central glyph with the etched symbol. The parchment seemed to hum, a low vibration that resonated through the stone and into my hands. From my satchel, I withdrew the items the map had indicated: a small, intricately carved bone figurine, a vial of black, viscous liquid, and a handful of dried, brittle herbs that crumbled to dust at the slightest touch. As I began to arrange them, following the precise instructions etched onto the map's hidden layer, the entity struck with full force. It wasn't a roar, but a silent scream that tore through my mind, 1,000 voices shrieking in unison. Visions assaulted me, flashes of unspeakable acts committed in these very depths, of sacrifices made, of blood spilled. I saw my own face, contorted with madness, reflected in pools of stagnant water, saw myself consumed by the same hunger that now emanated from the dais. A crushing weight pressed down on me, forcing me to my knees. The air was ripped from my lungs. My hands trembled, threatening to drop the delicate ritual components. "You are mine," a thought echoed in my skull, not a voice, but a primal, possessive certainty. "Your blood is my blood." I focused on the lines of the map, on the precise placement of each item. This was my battle, a duel of wills. My intellect against its ancient, raw power. My knowledge against its insidious influence. I uncorked the vial, the black liquid smelling of grave dirt and something impossibly old. As I poured it into the etched lines of the symbol, the dais pulsed with a sickly, internal light. Finally, I placed the bone figurine at the center, its vacant eyes seeming to stare into my very soul. As the figurine settled, the entity recoiled. The crushing weight eased, but a new sensation took its place, a searing, internal burn. A part of you, for a part of me. Forever linked. Forever marked. The pain was exquisite, a tearing sensation within my mind, as if my carefully ordered internal landscape, my precise mental maps, were being ripped apart, replaced by shifting, chaotic, unmappable horrors. The meticulous cartographer, who sought to define and delineate the world, now felt an infinite, terrifying chaos bloom within him. The ritual was complete. The dais pulsed once more, then the black stone seemed to absorb the light, drawing the malevolent presence inward, sealing it beneath the earth. The overwhelming pressure lifted. The air, though still heavy with the scent of decay, no longer felt charged with ancient malice. I stood, my body shaking, my mind reeling. The entity was contained, banished, perhaps, but the cost. The cost was etched into my very being. I was no longer whole. The metronome inside my skull, the relentless, rhythmic ticking of a mind once ordered by coordinates and contours, snapped. My carefully constructed internal cartography, the precise mental maps that defined my existence, had not merely shifted, they had been obliterated, leaving behind a churning, featureless void where familiar landmarks once stood. I lay amidst the dust and splintered wood, a broken vessel cast upon a desolate shore. My body, a symphony of aches and tremors, felt alien, a mere shell clinging to a consciousness that barely recognized itself. The air, heavy and thick, tasted of ancient earth, of pulverized stone, and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like lightning striking damp soil, mingling with the sweet, cloying decay of forgotten things. My eyes, crusted and slow to focus, swam in the dim, bruised light filtering through a gaping hole in the roof, a wound in the sky. A low moan escaped my lips, a sound I barely recognized as my own, ragged and parched. I pushed myself up, each movement a fresh agony, my muscles screaming in protest. Deep, jagged furrows marred my forearms, as if etched by unseen claws, and a searing line, still tender, ran from my temple down to my jaw. These were not mere scratches, They were brands, testament to a struggle that had occurred not just in the physical realm, but in the very core of my being. The scars felt ancient, as if they had always been there, waiting to surface. The estate, my ancestral home, was a ruin. What had once been a grand, if decaying, structure was now a skeletal testament to a cataclysm. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light, a silent, swirling ballet above the debris of shattered furniture, upturned volumes, and fragments of glass that glittered like malevolent eyes. The air thrummed with the memory of violence, a low, resonant hum that vibrated in my teeth. I stumbled forward, my legs unsteady, drawn by an instinct I couldn't name. My feet, bare and cut, crunched over fallen masonry. The grand staircase, once an elegant curve, now lay twisted and broken, its balustrade splintered like kindling. Now, it was just another casualty. The ornate newel post had snapped, its polished wood reduced to jagged splinters, and the steps themselves were uneven, some collapsed entirely, others listing precariously. It was no longer a trap, but a monument to the battle that had raged. Yet, as I gazed into its shattered depths, a flicker of something new, something unsettlingly clear asterisk, stirred within me. I saw not just the broken wood and stone, but the patterns of its destruction, the vectors of force, the echoes of a struggle that transcended mere physical impact. The entity was gone. But its departure had not left me whole. A fragment. A shard of its understanding, perhaps, or a sliver of its primal, chaotic energy. My mind, once a precise instrument for mapping the tangible world, now perceived an underlying stratum, a hidden geography beneath the surface of reality. I saw not just the shattered glass, but the inherent weakness in its molecular structure, the way light refracted through its imperfections. I heard not just the settling creaks of the old house, but the minute shifts in the earth beneath, the slow, imperceptible erosion of time itself. This new perception was terrifying. It was as if a veil had been torn, revealing the raw, unvarnished truth of existence, a truth too vast, too unmappable for a human mind to bear. The chaos I had fought against now resonated within me, a discordant harmony. My cartographer's instinct, once a source of comfort and control, was now a torment. How could I map the unmappable? How could I impose order on the intrinsic entropy of the universe, a truth I now felt in my bones? The world no longer felt solid, but permeable, its boundaries fluid, its foundations illusory. My breath hitched, a gasp that tasted of grit and despair. The outside world, I knew, remained blissfully unaware. The sun would rise and set, the seasons would turn, the distant village would carry on with its mundane rhythms, entirely oblivious to the ancient horror that had awakened and then receded beneath these very lands. My struggle, my transformation, was mine alone. There would be no witnesses, no absolution, no understanding. Not as a possession, but as a seat of knowledge, a terrifying clarity that blurred the lines between myself and the very thing I had fought. I was no longer just Reid, the meticulous cartographer. I was a vessel, a living map of the unknown, etched with the scars of a truth too terrible to comprehend. And I, irrevocably changed, was now a landscape of unmappable horrors myself. The tearing ceased. Not a gentle unraveling, but a sudden, violent cessation, like a taut rope snapping under impossible strain. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but a profound, crushing presence, a vacuum that sucked the very air from my lungs, the very thought from my mind. I was a hollow chamber, echoing with the ghost of a scream I hadn't made, a void where a meticulous, ordered self once resided. When I finally moved, it was not with conscious intent, but a clumsy, lurching effort, as if learning to walk anew. The stone floor beneath my hands was slick, not with moisture, but with a residue I dared not identify, a slickness that clung to my skin and permeated my senses. I do not recall the ascent from the deepest chamber, only fragments. My hands, when I finally saw them in the dim, filtering light of the upper tunnels, were stained, not with grime, but with a deep, indelible hue that seemed to seep from within the skin itself. I remember the stairwell that loops back to the same landing. I recall its worn steps, the familiar curve of the banister beneath my trembling fingers. But it was not the same. Each step was a repetition, a cruel echo of the last, and the landing, when I reached it, was not an arrival but a return. I ascended, and ascended again, the same grimy window casting the same pale rectangle of light, the same faint scent of damp stone and decay. It was a physical manifestation of the loop in my mind, the endless circuit of a thought that had nowhere to go, a memory that refused to settle. Eventually, though I cannot say how long it took, the illusion broke. Or perhaps, I simply stumbled through it, a phantom limb finally finding its way home. I emerged into the ancestral home, not through a grand entrance, but through a forgotten service door, a portal from one kind of death to another. The familiar scent of aged wood and forgotten lives was now tainted by the metallic tang that clung to me, a scent that I alone could perceive. Days bled into weeks. The estate, once a puzzle to be solved, became a burden to be shed. I moved through its rooms like a ghost, packing, sorting, discarding. My cartographer's tools lay untouched, gathering dust. The maps, once my passion, now held a terrifying new dimension. Every contour, every elevation line, every shaded forest seemed to pulse with a hidden life, a secret truth that only I now understood. The meticulous precision that had defined my life felt like a cruel joke, a veil torn away to reveal the chaotic, malevolent truth beneath the surface of the world. I tried to return to my former life, to the quiet solitude of my studies, the satisfying scratch of pen on parchment. But the world had shifted on its axis. The vibrant greens of the city parks seemed sickly, the bustling crowds a cacophony of meaningless noise. My colleagues, when I encountered them, spoke of mundane concerns, of grants and deadlines, their words reaching me as if through a thick pane of glass. They saw a tired man, perhaps, a man aged by grief or stress. They did not see the new geometry of my soul, the way the world now unfolded before me, revealing the hidden lines of force, the ancient currents that flowed beneath the veneer of civilization. The price paid was not a simple transaction. It was a fundamental alteration of my being. The metronome inside my skull, once a precise instrument of order, was gone. In its place was a different rhythm, a slow, deliberate pulse, like the turning of a great, submerged wheel. It was the beat of the earth itself, the deep, resonant thrum of the entity I had unearthed, the force I had, in some terrifying, unknown way, appeased. I sold the estate. Or rather, I had an agent handle the transaction. I could not bear to set foot on its grounds again, yet I could not truly leave it. The knowledge I carried was a brand, a permanent inscription on my psyche. I knew what lay beneath, what slumbered, and what it had taken from me to ensure its continued rest. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, when the city lights dimmed and the world hushed, I feel a subtle pull. A compulsion to look at a certain map, to trace a particular line, to consider the topography of a forgotten place. It is not an order, not a demand, but a suggestion, an inclination that feels utterly my own, yet undeniably alien. I have become a guardian, though I never sought the role. My cartographer's eye, once used to chart the known world, is now attuned to the unknown, to the subtle distortions in the fabric of reality. I study seismic data, geological surveys, ancient texts. I search for anomalies, for places where the veil might thin, where the earth might stir. I do not seek to unleash it, or even to understand it fully. I seek only to ensure its continued slumber, to maintain the fragile peace I purchased at such a terrible cost. The entity is contained, yes, but its tendrils have woven themselves into the very warp and weft of my existence. I am no longer Reid, the meticulous cartographer. I am Reid, the sentinel, forever bound to a secret that hums beneath the surface of the world, and within the depths of my own haunted mind.